Hello to everyone. Good afternoon to some, good after morning to others, depending on what part of the planet you find yourself in. And I say that genuinely. We have attendees today from 27 states, 4 different countries across 132 various organizations, and you've signed in with 131 different titles. So to the point of diversity, wow, we've got culture, we've got location, and we have profession all represented here, various organizations that you're providing service in, and we are excited to have you a part of our discussion today. It is July. It was August of last year that we had our first community conversation. Here we're rounding out nearly a full year of these discussions, and they've been so valuable. Today will be exceptionally valuable as well. I'm excited to introduce our guest to you in just a moment, but before I do that, I want to just take care of a few housekeeping items. The conversations are designed to last about 1 hour, and we are going to spend the bulk of the first 45 minutes answering your questions. As a part of signing up today, you submitted several questions. Unfortunately, we won't get to all of them, but we've done our best to organize them in a way that makes the most sense, that matters, and addresses the topics of today. Also, in addition to that, throughout the conversation, there are a couple features as a part of Zoom. First of all, there's the chat feature. We encourage you to respond, react, put thought into the chat as we go through the discussion. I'll be monitoring it here. So for those of you that are on, love for you just to say hello in the chat, just so we get a sense for who's paying attention and who's multitasking. And I will keep close dibs on that. In addition to the chat feature, we also have a Q&A function. And I want to be very clear about, thank you, Wendy, and I'm seeing those highs coming in. I want to be clear about the use for two. The chat is a great tool just to foster engagement with you throughout the discussion portion. The Q&A section is a nice place for you to submit your additional questions, because after we've gone through the first 45 minutes, we want to leave the balance of the 15 minutes to address whatever questions show up in real time, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. So just to distinguish between response from question, please use the two very well. That being said, I have my colleague Krista on board with us as well. She will be monitoring both, and we'll make sure we address as many needs as possible. I think that covers most of my housekeeping items, which now brings me to the best part of our hour, and that is our guest. I am so happy to introduce, well, first let me just introduce myself. I'm Phil Gwoke, Managing Director of BridgeWorks, the organization that's been hosting these. But more importantly, or equally importantly, we have a special guest today, and it is Velma Korbel, who has become a friend over the last year or so to partner organizations that we work with. And let me just give you some highlights from Velma's background. She currently serves as the Vice President, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer of API Group, an amazing organization that is doing some great work in the manufacturing sphere. She has 25 years in the public sector furthering civil rights underneath her belt, 10 years most recently with the City of Minneapolis as Director of the Department of Civil Rights, and she has served as the chairperson of the Minnesota Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So these are some great accolades as it relates to our conversation. She is also engaged in several other organizations that she provides her support and contribution to. And additionally, she is a veteran of the United States Navy. So Velma, first of all, welcome. Thank you for your service. Welcome to this conversation. And I'm just curious, of all the things that you have accomplished over the course of your very distinguished career, what are you the most proud of?
Well, first of all, Phil, thank you for that warm welcome. I'm pleased to be here. It's always an honor when folks ask me to just share some of my thoughts and some stories from my journey as a leader. But one of the things that I'm most proud of is I've had the opportunity over the years to mentor several people. And I think, to me, I just feel like it's a blessing to me to see those individuals sort of achieve the pinnacle of what they believe to be their success. And so there are people placed in some pretty significant roles around the country that I've had under my tutelage, have worked in the departments with me under my leadership. And I think the ability to mentor someone to see their success and their growth as a leader has been probably one of the most rewarding things in my professional career. And I like to joke to people that one of the things, the other thing that I'm most proud of is I've got two amazing adult children who obviously, I didn't screw up too badly because they are just really kind of the apples of my eyes. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Oh, I love that. And I don't think there's that legacy aspect of life is really what matters most. You can't take the things that you accumulate with you, but you certainly can leave behind a positive impression. And so to do that with our kids and other people's kids is truly an honor. And that's what we get to do today. We get to share some wisdom with some folks who've joined us, and also we'll learn from them based on their questions and insights that they have. So to that point, let's start getting to some of the questions that people have been raising within the context of the framework of our discussion today. And for those of you that did sign up, you saw we're going to try to hit 4 key content areas today. And the first one is really about the mindset of this topic of diversity, equity, inclusion. Velma, when I first spoke with you a few months back, you were sharing with me some of your perspective on those. And I remember just immediately jotting some notes down because this is something I'm passionate about, but always learning. And please, I would like you to share your definitions of those words, diversity, equity, inclusion, because so many organizations that we work with, they're putting these practices into place, but they're still wrestling with what it means and what it should look like. So give us 25 years of experience in your perspective on what it should come down to.
I'll tell you what I believe, that some people get wound up about the acronym DEI and they think it's monolithic, and I don't see it as that. These are separate and distinct initiatives in the universe of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And before I talk to you about the definitions, I also want to just say, I'm a fan of the Intercultural Development Inventory, the IDI. And there may be people on this phone call who are qualified administrators. I'm a qualified administrator, have worked with the Intercultural Development Inventory for about the last 10 or 12 years. So some of the language that I use will be familiar with people who understand that assessment. And so when I define diversity, equity, and inclusion, I do draw on some of the concepts from the Intercultural Development Inventory. And we define diversity as the differences that make a difference. And those differences can be across multiple diversity dimensions. And they're usually those differences that are going to be the things that, if you're in the workplace, they could be the characteristics and the qualities that might affect how you get promoted, how you get hired, how you move through an organization, how you get to access resources, etc. I define equity as the changes that create change. Most people think of equity as the result, and I don't think of it as that necessarily. I think of equity as really analyzing and evaluating what got us to the point, what got us here. When you see disparity, when you see inequities in a place, in a business, in a workforce, what are the reasons? What are the causes? How did we get here? Why are we here at this point? So I say equity, the changes that create change. And I look at inclusion. For me, power is at the center of inclusion. And it is that shift of power that widens the circle of opportunity for all. Because when you think about inclusion being the bridge between diversity and equity, power is not, or people aren't the problem. It's the power that's the problem. And it's the power that is who holds it, who sees it, who's using it as a lever. And so when you talk about inclusive environments, to me, the core of that is just the power balance.
A lot of great insights in there. I'm going to take notes. I encourage you to take notes as well. From time to time, I'm going to pause and point out some pro tools that we just got. I'm just curious, real quickly, Velma, the intercultural development inventory, is that something that anyone on this call might have access to through a website, learning more about it? Again, from a BridgeWorks standpoint, we're not advocating for one or the other, but I know so many folks always come here looking for a resource, something that they could use. Is that something folks can get to?
The intercultural development inventory is an assessment of 50 items, and it is an assessment that really rates your intercultural competence. And it's so unique because it really tells you where you can go with your intercultural competence development. And so those 50 items are really about answering questions that show how you think you're showing up in intercultural interactions, but also there's a metric there on how you're really showing up, how you're actually showing up in intercultural interaction. So I've been a fan of the assessment for a long time. And I think it's a great way to build that self-awareness in individuals and organizations. And if you just go to any search engine and Google up intercultural development inventory, it'll probably take you right to the website and you can sign up to take that assessment. I think it's the cost is minimal.
Excellent. And my our attendees, as well as my colleague Chris, has been dropping some links into the chat for those of you that are interested in it. So I want to make sure you had access to that tool. So thank you all. I really appreciated what you said in terms of that inclusion piece when you talked about that, the power dynamic, that people aren't the problem, right? I think so often one of the things that makes this conversation difficult is it doesn't take long for people to start to feel like they're being attacked. But when you step back a little bit and say there is a problem, we want to acknowledge that there are inequities, that these are real challenges, but to shift that mindset is what makes it beneficial. Which kind of brings me to my next question that's one of our attendees submitted, and it is, what makes some DEI training programs successful and others not successful? I have some thoughts on this, but I want to hear from your perspective. What's the difference between those that work and those that don't?
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer it two ways. I was at a session with the State Advisory Committee, the group that I chaired that Phil mentioned, where we had a Professor Jean Borghita from the University of Minnesota talking to us about unconscious bias training and why it works and why it doesn't work. And Professor Brigida actually said that when you mandate certain types of training, there's actually greater learning and greater retention. And so when he talked about unconscious bias, he said that some of these where you make a training sort of by invitation or you ask people to opt in, sometimes you get more value and more benefit when you do make training or require it to be mandatory. But from my experience over the years, I can tell you why I think certain of these trainings work and some don't. And the ones that don't work are the ones that don't have a connection to an organization's values. Every organization has some stated values. Everybody wants to be better, do better. But organizations that provide a DEI learning opportunity and is not connected to a set of sound values is usually not going to yield what the organization thinks it's going to yield. It's also more likely that some sort of learning opportunity that way is just going to be one and done. Is happening just because people want to do it for some sort of compliance reason. But the companies that have made diversity, equity, and inclusion a value, have made inclusion a value, will create opportunities for learning. And some will be opt-in, some will be voluntary, but there are others who will say, at a minimum, if you're going to work in this organization, we want you to be able to behave this way. If there's a competency for inclusion in your workplace, there's likely going to be some sort of learning opportunity to make sure that that gets embedded in that culture.
That's really, really interesting. And I can see, I think one response to the idea of a mandated program might be, well, then it's not genuine, then it's not authentic. But not having been at the session, my assumption is Professor Brigida, am I pronouncing it? Yeah. My assumption might be because that's when when it's mandated, the organization saying this is truly important to us.
Exactly.
We're willing to have you come off the line, whatever that means, depending on what industry you're in. It is so important. We will pay you to learn this content because it matters, which ties nicely to what you said about it has to be a part of the value proposition of the organization.
That's right.
I know one of the things that we have found so successful in our work in generational diversity is one, it's a lens of diversity that includes everyone, but it also invites everyone to join into the conversation. It tends not to marginalize or push people out, especially the way that we approach it. We look at each lens as valuable, and we found that something that engages people, and it helps the likelihood of success when folks don't feel like they're the problem, but no, they're a part of this conversation. So that's something the way I would answer it. But it brings up another question that someone submitted in our session today. And I like this one because you could sense this is coming out of personal experience. This person asks, what would you say to folks that say things like, I don't understand why having diversity in the room makes a difference in getting the work done. And so you talked about how it needs to be tied to the value. So how do you address when they're getting pushback from their peers, their colleagues? You know, all that matters is the work. That's all that matters. What do you say to those folks?
I would first ask, well, who's making that statement? Who's asking that question? You know, what level of the organization is that coming from? Because if it is coming from your top leaders, you have a little bit more work to do in making the case for DE&I.
True.
But if it's coming from, you know, line staff or others in the organization, I think there's an answer, but there's also a reason for that. And you know, I'm not trying to sell the intercultural development inventory on this session today, but one of the things that it will tell you if you have taken it or have an opportunity to take it, that individuals and organizations that make those kinds of statements are just living the fact that we live in a minimization culture. And folks who are in minimization are going to be folks who are going to say things like, you know, they don't see color. I'm colorblind. We don't need to have this diversity and inclusion training. When we do diversity and inclusion training, it's just going to create more conflict. And so you need to understand the organizational culture and the organizational mindset to know why that question is being asked, because the person who's asking it has never done any of the self-reflection that is necessary if you're going to be self-aware around intercultural competence or cultural fluency, because you cannot start a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey without turning a mirror on yourself first. Most people think that inclusion is something that happens over there. Well, actually, no, inclusion starts right here, right with you. And so understand why that question might be being asked, because that's a cultural issue that is going to have to be addressed in order for any sort of DEI learning that you're going to try to implement or promulgate through your organization to ever take effect.
As you were sharing your thoughts there, my mind went back to your definition of diversity as the difference that makes a difference.
The differences that make a difference.
Differences that make a difference. And so I'm just wondering, you know, to that person who wants to be colorblind, and I'm not familiar with the term minimization culture, so that's kind of interesting to me. But it almost seems like that's where understanding the value of diversity comes in, because you know, if you just said we don't need this, you're missing out on the fact that this is the difference that makes a difference. Could you maybe speak to a little bit of maybe expand on the difference that makes a difference in your perspective? Where does the fullness come in? How do we capitalize on that strength there?
You know, I don't try to ascribe a definition to the difference. There are so many different cultural markers in our organizations and in our world. Most people think when they talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's about race and ethnicity or about gender identity. But when we talk about culture in an organization, we're talking about all kinds of cultural characteristics, and they could be race and ethnicity and gender, but there's the generational. There's also disability, GLBTQ, sexual orientation, religion. So all of those cultural dimensions matter when we talk about creating an inclusive culture. And here in the organization where I work, we have just a really firm and enduring position that we are going to build great leaders.
Mm.
That is a hallmark of API Group where I work. But my response to them when I hear that mantra is that you can't be a great leader unless you're an inclusive leader. If you're going to be an inclusive company, inclusive leaders build inclusive companies. And so for us here at API, when we're talking about being inclusive leaders are self-aware, and they know how they are grounded in their ability to navigate and communicate across these different cultures. And we are using that assessment that I mentioned, the intercultural development inventory, to build that self-awareness. So we have a starting place. So we start speaking the same language, talk about the same themes, so that we can move forward together as an organization.
Thank you. I really appreciate the fact that you bring to light that this conversation is so much broader than just unfortunately the challenges that have drawn our attention to it, whether it be racial tension and specifically in the African American community. But when you're talking culture, Dr. Chu, our last guest, she mentioned how culture can boil down to one person's definition of cleanliness versus another, and that they bring all kinds of conversation. Is my office clean or isn't it clean? Culture shows up so many ways. So an inclusive leader has that, as you pointed out, the self-awareness to begin to think and see in a broader context. It's a really important point. And several of our questions that came in today, we might get to some in the post Q&A or the Q&A portion, but they were asking specifically about cultures and the individual lenses of diversity. Wanted the conversation to go bigger than that, and so people want to know something beyond just the race tension that we often discuss this in the context of. And I think you're providing solutions that create a mindset that can be applied anywhere, which is really important. I want to move to our next section. We mentioned that we're going to talk about performance outcomes that can occur when you treat D&I as a state of being versus a reactive initiative. And when I first met you via Zoom, these virtual conversations, you said something that was really interesting. You said, on one hand, it's sad that it takes a tragic moment for the country, for the world, really, to begin talking about something that you've been addressing for 25 years, trying to bring attention to. On the other hand, you're glad because at least something began to move the ball rolling, which I appreciated your transparency there. But here's another question that someone's asking, and you can tell they're really wrestling with this. This is personal to them. And they gave quite a bit of context for the question that they're trying to get to, because as a leader, it sounds like in this organization, they're looking for that fine line between when it's okay to tell someone how they should be versus what they should do. And I appreciate their heart here. So the question was, what are the practical markers that indicate DE&I as has become a state of real being versus something that we're just reacting to? And does this happen at an individual level or an organizational level? So how do we move people to a place where they own something? And can we tell people what they should own? Can we tell them how they should be versus just what they should do?
So let me start by saying this, that the workplace is not a democracy. So let's just be real when we say that. And where a person works, who they work for, who they work with, that's a choice that an individual makes. Employers have the right to state what type of culture they want to have inside their organization. and employees get to decide if that culture is consistent with their own personal values. And if it's not the case, don't spend your life trying to make it so, because that is just going to end up being you not being able to be your authentic self at work, and it's going to just create a lot of years of angst and discontentedness. But when I think about the doing versus the being, no, there's so many organizations and so many places where DE&I, each of those pillars is just transactional. They're just actions that people take that don't really mean much. They're not sustainable, and they don't go to the heart of the issue. And so I'm not suggesting that employers have the right or the obligation to indoctrinate people to be who they want them to be, but organizations do have the right to state values and to create the culture that they want to create inside their organizations. And when that becomes something that doesn't line up with what an individual believes ought to be a place where they should be working, then don't waste your life trying to make your workplace something it's never going to be.
Mm, mm. That's a lot of self-empowerment talk right there. You know, where we have the choice to decide, do we want to stay? And employers have the choice to decide what type of culture they want to create.
That is exactly it. Mm-hmm.
And yet in today's world, you know, this is a shift. I've been in my professional life long enough to recall a time when people didn't talk so much about workplace culture, but yet people entering the workplace now, that really matters to them. They want to know that there's some cultural alignment. Back in the day, it was, you know, am I good at my job and am I getting paid for it? As far as as I recall, and there's a definite shift. So empowering people to make that choice for themselves really matters. Let's come back to this idea of how organizations go about creating that where it really is a place of being. So how do you measure? What would you recommend to organizations? I know we've talked about the assessment quite a few times here, but what do you think folks should be striving toward? Or, you know, the question specifically was how do you measure having success in this area? But what would you speak to that? What would you say to the people on the call?
There's a couple ways to measure it. Of course, transactionally, you're going to be looking at recruiting numbers, engagement numbers, retention numbers, customer loyalty numbers, healthy growth numbers. But that's the transactional stuff. That's what happens early in a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. What we're striving for is something that's transformational. And you know that by, by listening to people, by asking them. You know that because you're getting repeat customers, folks coming back. You have ambassadors, sponsors, and folks talking about your organization when you don't even know they're saying good things about you. No, you can talk it up, you can talk a good game, but people who are in relationships with you, who are interacting with you, they know whether or not you're walking the talk. And so an inclusive company is going to be doing all of those transactional things with the eye towards creating something that's transformational. And your employees are going to be your best ambassadors for how transformational your company is and how inclusive your organization is.
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the questions that came in, we won't get to it because you just answered it brilliantly. And this was the thought that I had when it came in was, how do we promote the fact that we're an organization that's inclusive? And my first thought was, well, if you genuinely are, if it is something that is authentic, if it is genuinely lived out, your folks are going to be the greatest promoters of it.
Right.
We live in a time where social media and all the different tools that are out there, people talk and they'll say, oh man, we love working at fill in the blank group, so it has to be real, most definitely. You mentioned earlier, how there is value to mandating participation if this is something that is important to organizations' values and cultures. One of the other questions that came in is, What role does learning and development play in DE&I strategy? What do you think the key ways, methods, mediums, topics of learning to prioritize for impact would be? So if a group says, hey, this is important to us, and here's what we want our folks to start learning to stay engaged, what would you advise them?
You know, there's a lot in that question, but let me just start by saying that if, as an organization, you have a stated value for diversity, equity, and inclusion, uh, please have some learning opportunities that support your values. So start by, if you don't have the wherewithal to create your own learning opportunities, there are lots of good platforms out there that have already curated learning opportunities that you can go to and get really good stuff for your organization. But I would also say that learning and development is critical to changing a culture in any organization. Whether you want to be on a DEI journey or a safety journey or an innovation journey, the learning and development and organization of development components of an organization are the ones that drive that change. So your learning and development center is going to be really the fulcrum of change in an organization that's on a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Um, we talked about transformational experience or expectation versus just transactional. And I think one of the things you and I discussed early on was this doesn't have an end game because culture continues to
Mhm,
evolve. And
mhm,
that's a tough pill for a lot of organizations to swallow because we we've,
mhm,
at least in Western culture, we're so
mhm,
goal oriented, accomplish this task. I mean, we're in the middle of the Olympics right now. We look at these athletes who've trained their whole lives to go for gold, and then
mhm.
they get there, and there's an arriving point, and yet this is something that will continue to be nurtured and developed. And one of the things that when I first was introduced to API, I really appreciated the leadership component that you're
Mhm,
continually developing people. Um, so as we move to talking a little bit about corporate impact and how this shows up within organizations, the question was, how do you produce a case study for C-suites that are not 100% on board to get them committed to a long-term goal? And the reason I prefaced this question with my previous comments was, it doesn't sometimes resonate with leaders who are so goal oriented when this is an ongoing state of being. So how do you go about that? What do you recommend?
I think you got to appeal to two aspects of the human brain,
Mm,
right and left sides. You got to tell the heart story and you got to tell the head story. And the head story is for those folks in your C-suite who really need the business case. They need the data, they need the results, they need the key performance indicators, they need the stuff, they need the transactions. So
mm,
you have to tell that story. So do your homework, do your research. There are all kinds of good things out there from, Harvard Business Review, McKinsey, PricewaterhouseCoopers. So there's lots of people out there that BridgeWorks have put together a whole bunch of really good data to help you make the head case for your diversity, equity, inclusion journey. But you also have to make the heart case.
mm,
Heart, HEART, the heart case. It's a shame that in order to begin a diversity, equity, inclusion journey, you have to make the business case because the hard case says it's just the right thing to do. We spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day in the work settings, the place where we have an opportunity to make the most transformational. The most transformation is while we're with one another on our work sites, in
mm,
our offices, on our jobs. And so if we can apply that heart to what we're doing inside organizations, that 8, 10, 12 hours we're together, we can become better humans at work so that
mm,
we can be better humans when we leave the workplace. One of the things about the heart case as well is that one of the reasons that we seem to take 2 steps forward and 2 steps back, and 1 step back in our diversity, equity, inclusion journey is because the heart space and the business case sometimes work in concert to say, okay, we're done. So you notice about every decade, we find ourselves back talking about this with renewed energy. And that's because organizations get to a place where they think they have achieved all of their key performance indicators. The results say we're finished. And we're all works in progress. Organizations are works in progress. We're never going to be finished with this. And so I just say keep doing the work. We're not going to be done. I see it organizations, they talk about this hire for diversity, hire for diversity. They hire a woman in their C-suite. They put a woman on their board. They bring a Black or brown person in an organization. They start to share that power with those people. Remember, I talked about power being the core of inclusion. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, we're done. Good. We don't want to share too much power. And we are always going to be works in progress. And I think that's one of the things we need to continue to pay attention to. Let's just keep doing the work.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a cyclical nature to our lives. We buckle down. We're going to work on something. We get really focused because we get fed up with fill in the blank part of our, we want to improve a relationship dynamic. We want to improve our health, and we get really focused for a season, and we accomplish some success in that area. And then we go, wow, look, I did pretty good. And then we let our, take our eye off the ball, or foot off the gas, whatever analogy we want to use. And sure enough, those old habits slowly creep in, and we find ourselves back into that zone again. And it's a strange perspective, but that essentially is what keeps us, and it gives us opportunity at BridgeWorks, because we see these generational things happen again and again and again. And sure enough, people get really good at something, then the problem shows up, and then they call. Whereas there's a lot of work in preventative maintenance, and a lot of benefit to just staying on top of something, and just and that's where self-awareness comes in. I think it's really key. We're having some questions starting to come into the chat, which I appreciate. I want to get to these questions. We're going to move to our Q&A portion in just a few more minutes. But do me a favor, if you do have a very specific question that's not comment oriented, throw it into the Q&A portion, just so I make sure we get to it. So I just want to be real clear with our audience today. All right. So here's an interesting question. It's probably been answered, I think. I want to hope, as we talked about culture earlier, but I want to give you a chance to speak to it directly, Velma. The question is, how do you incorporate diversity when you live in a community that does not have a lot of diversity? Now, we're both based here in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, Minnesota, the Twin Cities. Pretty diverse. When you look at the greater state of Minnesota, not like you might find, at least as we define diversity traditionally in other parts of the country. But what would you say to this question? How do you strive for that when maybe you feel like there's not the same opportunity as other places?
I would say you have to approach it with some intentionality. You cannot become culturally fluent, or you cannot develop intercultural competence. You can't embark on a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey if just by proximity. You have to actually be trying to be intentional about exposing yourself to different cultural opportunities. So even if you are in a community that you believe to be homogeneous, I would challenge the question and say, are you thinking about diversity as merely the presence of visible diversity, where you need Black and brown people in community to say it's diverse, that you need women in community to say it's diverse? And I would challenge that, because I suspect there's not a community in North America that, if you really looked back at where you live, that there's not some tribal history there that one should be learning about. There's probably some history there about the people who built the community where you live. We have a tendency to come to work in very homogeneous workplaces and go back to work to our own social communities, which are also very homogeneous. We are never going to become culturally fluent by doing that day in and day out. We've got to create opportunities to go out and experience other cultures. So one of the things that I challenge people here to do is to learn about the community where you work, where you live, where your businesses are located. Read a book, go take a class, go into a community that makes you feel a little uncomfortable being there. But you will start to appreciate how welcoming that community might be to you. So you have to create opportunities when you're trying to really place yourself on a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. And don't just think about it initially as just, well, there's no Black or brown people here, so it's not that diverse. Well, there's some diversity there. Go and look for it. And let me also clarify for the people on this phone call, I'm not suggesting that there is not a racism problem in this country. There's a racism problem. There's an anti-Black problem in this country. So when I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm talking about a whole different thing that is just a subset of the societal problems that we're dealing with around race and racism. So I don't want to try to minimize that. I don't want you to think anything that I'm saying is minimizing that issue, because trust me, I live in that. But from a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey, we need to think of diversity as not just the 2 or 3 diversity markers that we tend to think about. There's a whole range of diversity dimensions in the communities where we live.
Thank you so much for giving those tangible examples of what intentionality could look like, because you're absolutely right. There is not a community that does not have diversity within it. We just have we've been conditioned to label it in certain contexts. And I think the result of that intentionality is we're seeing so much change on a constant basis. But when opportunities do arise for that, for individuals who might not have the proximity with Black and brown people, but when it arises, they're going to be more engaged to connect with those communities because they've been practicing it in other parts of their life. So it's, you're preparing your mind for that awareness that you talked about earlier with inclusive leadership, that, it becomes so valuable for us as human beings.
Phil, you could teach my class, because I say a rising tide lifts all boats. Yeah. If you develop intercultural capability with a culture in the community where you live, that's a skill that's transferable to all different types of cultures.
Yes.
So you could teach my class.
Well, you're very kind. I want to come take your class, though. How about that? But yeah, it's something I've had just the benefit of being in a lot of different settings, not by no choice of my own. It was just the result of my upbringing that then created this, I didn't know I was learning all along my life, but it has served me in so many different settings, which makes these conversations pretty fun. So, oh man, there was something else. We're getting right to our point where I want to open it up to some Q&A from our guests today, from our attendees. Let me see if there was another question that I wanted to get to here. Oh, there's so many other good ones. All right, well, friends who are joining us today, please, at this point, if you have not submitted a question, but you've got something on your mind that you want to ask either me or our guest Velma, please go ahead and enter those into the Q&A portion. I've got another probably 24 questions that we haven't even gotten to yet. So I'll start opening those up. But you took the time out of your busy schedules to be with us, and we want to make sure that you're valued as a result of that. But I really appreciated everything you've shared with us so far today, Velma. I'm looking forward to hearing you answer some specific questions. I'm gonna circle back because now I just have a question as it relates to your definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion. Equity, you said changes that make change. And you said you don't look at it as something that, as it's the result, it's more the action. Could you speak more to that a little bit and maybe give us a strategy or two as to how people can incorporate equity from making change, please? Inclusion
is really what we're striving for here, right? We are we are working to build organizations, teams, companies where people come to work every day and can be their authentic selves. They have a sense of belonging, their voices are heard, they're involved, they're engaged. We value them. That's really the destination. Equity is transitional. And the way we look at equity here is that that transition requires us to be questioning. You know, let's analyze why does the disparity in women and people of color, or women and men, or white people and people of color exist in our workforce? Why do we have you know, why is our giving not going into communities that have the most need? Why is our diverse spend not being utilized to leverage business opportunities with businesses owned by women and people of color? So our equity, the changes that create change, are really doing that analysis and trying to answer those questions. Though inclusion is the effect of a lot of policies and a lot of written and unwritten, or lack of inclusion is the effect of a lot of policies written and unwritten over the decades. And so our equity, the analysis, is the cause of that, trying to really research and dig deep into the cause of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, I'm going to ask a question here. Someone submitted it, and I want to be responsible with what folks have been asking. Again, we've talked about the bigger picture, but we know recently, beyond what's happening in African Americans in the United States and literally globally, there's a lot of evidence that there's challenges there with Black people worldwide. There's also been awareness raised to some of the challenges with Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and so on. So when it comes to addressing these events that come up, okay, I've interviewed people, and they've said how, you know, where their organization might have blanket policies. When something goes wrong, when a tragedy happens, people don't know how to talk about it, and they feel like, yes, they're cared for as a person, but they're not given that time to like respond. I mean, so the question is, how do you address Asians in your DE&I corporate strategy? But I think I want to take that to, what would you advise organizations when an event happens? I work with a group out in New York, and there's been some attacks against the Jewish community, and they're a Jewish organization. They took the word Jewish down from their sign because they wanted to protect their people, you know? So what do you advise when things go wrong? How should people or leaders or just peers address those moments in time?
I think organizations have got to be empathetic. And I think that's missing, that's a quality that's missing in a lot of leaders and certainly in a lot of organizations, because for some reason over the years, we've been taught that it is not good business to be empathetic. So what we've done in my previous employer and now here at API is that we are not ignoring the fact that our workplaces are microcosms of the real world, and the things that are going on outside of these walls are affecting our people, and they're bringing that into work every day. So we are creating opportunities and spaces where people can have conversations that matter to them. This year was the first time that API had a conversation about what it means to be Black in the aftermath of all of the things that were going on around after the George Floyd murder. We had an opportunity this year for the first time to have a conversation about anti-Asian violence because we know that that was going on out in community. And we also want to have those conversations because we want our employees to know that, first of all, there's zero tolerance inside this organization for any behavior that sets any of our employees up for being traumatized, victimized, discriminated against. But it really was the first time this year we've had real conversations about the things that are going on out in society, knowing that it is affecting the mental well-being of our employees. And as I said earlier, if we're going to be together 8, 10, 12 hours a day, this is where those conversations are likely going to happen in these multicultural environments, because they're not likely to happen in a healthy, meaningful, sort of interculturally dynamic way in our homogeneous communities. So this is where we have to have those conversations in our workplaces.
And you've taken some steps to make sure that those
We,
conversations are
we
happening,
have.
which I think is uh, incredibly beneficial. It takes courage to do so. I'm a person who loves quotes. I keep quotes all over my desk. I just came across this one today. It's about from Gandhi. He says, "A coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It's the prerogative of the brave." And it
Mhm.
does take courage to engage in those conversations,
It
but
does.
that is the most loving, if you will, thing to do, especially in a corporate or organizational
Yeah.
setting.
Yeah.
Um, One of the questions that just came in, we had a good definition of diversity, great definition of equity. Would you share again your definition of inclusion?
I say that inclusion is the shift in power that widens the circle of opportunity.
Thank you very much.
And I mentioned earlier that no, people aren't the problem. Power is the problem.
Mhm.
And that again is how it's leveraged by those that have it and those that need it.
Yes. Uh, they said, "Can you say it one more time slower?" Because they're trying to write it down as they go.
Inclusion, the shift in power that widens the circle of opportunity.
Yes. And that is, again, this will be, I feel like we're promoting, like this is an advertisement for the IDI, which it is not. That's just one tool. If you go back on our YouTube channel, we post every one of these community conversations, and each of our guests have provided great tools that they have found useful in their profession. And so please know that we're not trying to promote any one thing over another, but we just want you to come away with some great resources. So
Right.
I just want to make that disclaimer there.
Right.
And I will give a promotion for our work at BridgeWorks. Again, we work in generational diversity. That's what we've done for over 20 years. And to the point of, I'm thinking back to the question where someone said, "Well, I live in a community where there isn't much diversity." What's fascinating to me is the person asking that probably comes from my generation. They're probably my age-ish. When you talk to young people today, their perspective and their lens of diversity is so much. It includes so many more things than I grew up with. And I was recently speaking with a friend who was talking about how, and he's a very open-minded individual, but his kids were challenging him, and they're
Mhm.
just 13 and 15 years old, on some of
Mhm.
the language that he was using at home. And so that's not inappropriate because they have a more inclusive
Mhm.
mindset. I think one of the things that you and I spoke about last time when we first met, you talked about the importance of language, I feel, and words. Would you
Mhm.
give any, that's a question that shows up with me, comes up to me often, like what do I say, what do I not say, or at least how do I begin to expand my vocabulary? What if I disagree with some of the usage of language? What would you say to folks that are wrestling with some of these questions?
I would absolutely say words have power, language matters. This is when I tell people, read a book. If you're challenged by a particular culture, and we all have a culture that we are challenged by, whether you want to admit it or not, you do. And that should be the culture specific learning that you should be intentional about engaging in.
Hmm.
And one of the things that um, sort of chills us or causes us to be hesitant in our diversity and inclusion journey and our intercultural learning is because we're afraid we're going to make a mistake. Well, one of the reasons you can minimize the likelihood that you're going to make a mistake is to educate yourself about the culture or cultures that you're challenged by.
Right.
And so I can't get on a call and say use these words or don't use these words or use these words, because language evolves. And the only reason you know or you can be relatively certain that the language that you're using is the language of which it has evolved, is to stay updated on the writings, the teachings, the academics, because that's how you're going to know. But language is so critical and so important. Understand what you're challenged by, and that's the learning that you should engage in.
Love that. I love that. Pro tip of the day, read a book. Well, we're wrapping up, coming down to the final 5 minutes. I don't think anyone else has asked additional questions. So Velma, I want to give you the final word. We've got about 50 or so folks that are still on the call with us. You have so much experience, so much wisdom. You have been engaged in this work for enough time to have some important thought for us today. So just as a wrap up, what would you send us away with? What do you think as we move forward into the remainder of 2021 and the future unfolding world? How would you advise these folks to what do you want them to take away today?
Please take this away, that we're all works in progress. We are all going to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, inadvertently offend, unintentionally offend, if we are genuinely trying to move our intercultural fluency, our intercultural capability. And so we have to be willing to extend grace, but also you have to be open-minded enough to receive grace. This is what it requires. Tell our stories, but let's do so being gracious to one another.
Yes. And sometimes gracious to ourselves. Sometimes we beat ourselves up for errors when our heart, we knew, was in the right place. And so thank you so much for that message, because in the times that we are living in, I think it's so important that we give each other a little bit of love, a little bit of grace.
Absolutely.
So that wraps up our conversation for today. And milestone marker, 12 months later, we've been hosting these conversations. It has been an incredible season of change in the world, in society, in each of our lives. And yet it's conversing, it's community, it's people learning from each other, mentoring one another, growing together, that I believe is going to be paramount to navigating whatever challenges lie ahead. So, and we are responsible for turning those challenges into a brighter future. So thank you for partnering with us on this journey. Thank you for being here today. Velma, thank you for your wisdom, for your insight, and for sharing some of your time and ideas. We thank you.
Thank you for having me.